based research to come together and share field sites and places and expertise and knowledge. And then finally, to also talk about how to engage our students in research and use our excellent and exotic field sites to attract students to our university and get our students involved in research, because those opportunities serve the students very well. They go on to do lots of other great things using research opportunities as a platform for graduate school scholarships and fellowships and the like. And so for the first third of this session, Chap is going to talk about his research in Kenya, and then I'll talk very briefly about some of the work that I'm doing in the aquatic realm, and then we'll talk about some of the other things, opportunities and collaborations on campus. Okay? So with that, Chap?
Thanks, Gil. I got here. I was in Kenya for Christmas and just came in last night. So I very quickly put this together. It's my first time here, and so I'm really, really excited to be here. I spent the last 20 years in Chicago at the Field Museum, where I also taught at University of Illinois at Chicago. But what really attracted me to AU is, particularly the anthropology department, is its commitment to social change and to addressing issues that we confront us today, including some of the ones that I enumerate here. And so when I started looking for a change and I saw this position, it was too hard to pass. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited at the holistic nature of the anthropology that is practiced here, its integrative and interdisciplinary perspective, but especially its commitment to social change and justice. But as an archaeologist, often I think I'm much more interested, at least intellectually, in looking at the past as a way of understanding where we are going. I work in a region in the world for which we know very little about. But in fact, if you look at this statement out here, you will find that for the larger part of our history, most people have lived and in fact died in Africa. Until at least 100,000 years ago, that was the only place that people in fact existed. And so I think as an archaeologist and a historian, I think the past is indispensable. Today I think it's very hard to say, but for this 6+ billion peoples, it is very clear that we only represent 7% of all the human beings who have lived. That is to say, out of every 14 people who have lived, out of every one person today, 13 of those have in fact lived and died. So as we look at present day's problems, we can only ignore the past at our own peril. In most cases, when you think about Africa, you sort of look at the more recent past, where that shaped, in fact, Africa's relationship with the West. This is really a time when Africa goes through a process of devolution, and that's what has really captivated our imagination about Africa, and in fact, our perceptions about Africa and sometimes even peoples of African descent. This is a challenge that we still deal with. But as academics, I think Africa is one of those really, really exciting places to study, precisely because you can't be an Africanist without being an interdisciplinary person. It doesn't matter whether you are studying mathematics or engineering, but in fact you have to use the interdisciplinary perspective. And so as a university professor and a student, Africa is one of the best laboratories to work. In my own research, I employ all of these methodologies for, in fact, understanding the African past. And so I can only use an interdisciplinary perspective in whatever field, in whatever area that I study. And I've used all of this. I'm no expert in any of those, but certainly I think I employ all these methodologies to unearth and understand Africa, and by extension, the peoples of Africa, us. My research interests are very broad. I'm interested in the issues of the rise of urbanism in Eastern Africa. I studied trading systems and networks in the Indian Ocean. I'm interested in issues of governance and leadership. I also study inequality and resistance. But I'm also interested in studying the biological genealogies of the peoples of Africa. Africans are the most mixed peoples anywhere in the world. And so I think understanding how they have interacted with each other helps us, in fact, understand some of the present problems, such as tribalism and ethnicity that bedevil Africa today. I have active ongoing programs in 4 countries. Kenya, the country where I grew up. I was originally born in Uganda, but we moved to Kenya when I was in 5 years. I work in Madagascar, in India, and China. And all these are essentially very active projects, which I hope in future will begin to involve several of our students, both undergraduates and graduate students. These are some of the images of places that I work. This is a major urban center in Kenya. It's called Gede. It dates from about 800 AD to 1500. This is an even earlier settlement dating from around 600 AD to 1430s. And this is a small colonial outpost in central Madagascar. And this is a small village in central Madagascar that I've been doing some research looking at the evolution of rice and cattle pastoralism. My research, because of its interdisciplinary nature, has always involved, in fact, talking and to the elders, to the people in places where we work. And interestingly, as I've been doing, collecting ethno-histories and life histories of these folks, I've also been able to walk around and look at the archaeological formation processes. Some of these abandoned homes eventually become archaeological sites that we essentially study. And so this has been just the nature of my work. And we've been doing this since 1989, and now have nearly 800 hours, recorded hours on video that we can very quickly turn into documentaries, but we can also transcribe and continue to. So I've gone to the same people over and over, and so as the story changes with age, you can study a lot of dimensions, including memory itself, and how their perspectives also change. These are some of the places that we have been working. This is the Mount Elgon area of Western Kenya, where we've been looking at the evolution of agriculture and agricultural systems. And this area is actually extremely beautiful. It's like these 10 months of the year. It has high rainfall regimes, extremely rich. I've been working on issues of local technologies with local pottery women. And I think that pottery technologies are very, very important, because archaeologically, 80% of what is left are things like this. And archaeologists have written a lot about pottery typology as a way of identifying groups. But ironically, whenever you talk to these potters, and you ask them the meanings of these symbols, they're totally meaningless. Most of them are just for aesthetic reasons, but have absolutely no meaning to it. So we make things up. In Madagascar, I've been working with local weavers in the Central Highlands. And in Madagascar, at the same time, I'm looking at the evolution of farming systems, the relationship between rice, agriculture, and, in fact, pastoralism. Because of the very thin soils in the Central Highlands and high erosion, what has really happened over the years is that rice has become so dependent on pastoralism. So that what they have done is evolve a system whereby the corrals, where dung essentially is so valuable that in fact cattle is the essence of the way of life of the Central Malgache peoples, particularly the Sileo and the Merina. And so one of the things that I'm doing is looking at the relationship between this and that, but also look at what happens when when cities evolve, because this is a very, very labor-intensive way of maintaining the land. Yes?
Oh, is that wall at the top part of a water control?
Well, this wall here is actually a corral. It's actually dug underground, and then when the cattle come, they're essentially put here, and so all of the dung is actually collected here, and then processed and harvested. So what's going on here is that these people are removing the dung and carrying it to the farms. So the question is, when, in the absence of cows, what happens? Because these are really some of the world's poorest folks. And so when I was working, I've been working here for the last 12 years. When I was working there, there was cattle rustling. And so people experienced a huge drop in the output of rice, and started importing rice from Thailand. And I was conflicted as an anthropologist, because I was there studying but also witnessing all of these changes. And so I asked them, have you ever arrested some of these cattle thieves? They said, we do. We take them to the police, and then they bribe the police, and they get off so easily. I said, have you tried to kill some of them? They said, no, we have not tried to do that. I said, why don't you do that? So I found myself, in fact, becoming this agent of change. I was supposed to interfere. And in fact, this is what happened. This is what happened, and when you go back to the villages, the village now is thriving, because they know that if you go to that village to steal cows, you won't come out alive. Right? But so that's just one of the other things. One of the things that I've been doing too is East Africa is an interesting place because it's so close to the Middle East. A lot of the residents of the east coast of Africa have very multiple ancestry. Their ancestors came from Persia, from South Asia, and all these places. So very, very mixed groups, like being in Sicily or being in London in a lot of ways, or being some of the early cities in Central America like Titicaca, where you have very mixed populations. So one of the projects we've been trying to do is try to understand where the biological genealogies of the coastal people. Another area of, in fact, collaboration in biogenetics and archaeology and history, all working together. So in essence, what we've done is we have collected the life histories of many of our informants. They're telling us where they think their ancestors came from, but we're also then collecting saliva and then testing that upon what their perceptions are. Archaeologically, we've been able to do a lot of surveys in the hinterland and in areas where we have been able to work we are able to find very vibrant villages and chiefdom communities that are developing, at least beginning from the last 10,000 years all the way to the present. And along the coast, you see the emergence of towns and essentially port towns, beginning from at least 3,000 years ago. So you have this kind of connections that are going on. The model that we have developed to explain how rural and urban peoples were related is essentially looking at systems of knowledge that people have spread. And essentially in the interior you have some pastoralists, hunters, and urbanites who are all working together. We begin to look at the system of how trade developed within this thing. When it comes to looking at connections, East Africa, where I work, is very much connected by language and culture, Islam, by geography, by religion, by trade, and by travel to this part of the world. So in many cases, the area that I'm working is really like that. So you couldn't really look at East Africa in isolation. You have to look at the coast, its hinterland, and then the national perspective. So an elite community, an elite family, an elite wealth, or the wealthy elite of East Africa around 1400 lived in homes like those. These are homes that you actually don't see when you come to the 18th century, because from around the 1600s, not a single house, permanent house like this was built all over the entire Africa. You might actually say that yes, there were, but these are essentially European fortresses that began to surround Africa. But before that, you had these places. And these are places that we study that could really be enlightening to shaking down some of the perspectives and the prejudices we have about African. Students are probably the best agents of this. Presently, we are working at this small town. It's called Manda. It's actually the oldest port town in East Africa. Interestingly, the town was actually divided into two, separated by a wall. And what we are doing is trying to determine why this wall, why these foreign people and these locals. Right? But these just two different neighborhoods that are separated by wealth differences, or by ethnicity. The town looks most like that. This is where it is standing. This is the oldest mosque in East Africa. Some of the structures. Last year we carried out some excavations and recovered some individuals as well as other artifacts. There's some of the trenches we excavated. And as we're beginning to think about work in some of these towns, we can't help separating some of this by gender and by age. And this is also informed by some of our own ethnographic assumptions and observations that we find in modern day East Africa. This is some of the artifacts that we are finding that show essentially some of the cottage industries that were being carried out there. These are bead grinders for making beads. This is for weaving, because they're making both, they're importing some beads, but they're also making some from marine and ostrich egg shells. But they're also processing rock crystal, which they are exporting to Asia and even to North Africa. They have their own forms of currency. Ivory was in fact a form of currency. You have this Yongle coin, which we found when we were there, and then of course cowrie shells. We believe that this Yongle coin may have been brought to East Africa by Admiral Chenha when he visited East Africa around 1425. So we're beginning to separate some of these in terms of just scales, some of the work that is going on. But we are also interested in issues of gender. In fact, one of the most important things that could be very, very useful for students here is essentially looking at some of the relationship between local women and, in fact, traders. We know that in the past, as today, traders are rarely accompanied by their wives, and of course these liaisons do exist. In fact, the development of diasporic communities worldwide might be, in fact, linked to understanding some of this relationship that might have existed. Looking at connections between East Africa and South Asia, I've essentially been looking at two contemporary sites, one in East Africa and another one in Chaul, Maharashtra. And as we move forward, one of the programs that we are going to develop here is essentially to have summer programs in two places that will run sort of alternate. So 1 year students will be in East Africa, and then the other summer they will be in India to sort of rotate. The same students going to both places, both graduate and undergraduate. I think in this way they will be able to really understand what is really going on and understand issues of early globalism and what this might actually mean. Sites in India are 4 or 5 times larger than what we have in East Africa. In fact, this is a site that I was visiting 2 months ago, and this is essentially where we are going to be working. It's a 500-hectare site. Chaul was the largest port, the second largest port when the Portuguese were there. The site is now in a dairy farm, but it's still, in fact, quite available for us. And the connection that one can see between this site and East Africa is the presence of baobab trees. They're essentially African domesticates. The sites there, the edge of Chaul is extremely old because it goes back to 200 BC. So essentially the people of Chaul interacted with Romans during that time. So it's 200 BC to 1750. Manda is 600 AD, 1750. It's a comparative. Some of the other work that I don't want to talk about because of time is the work that we are collaborating with my colleague, Dr. Chu from Sun Yat-sen. And essentially what we are looking at is trying to find out some of the trade ceramics that we find in East Africa and sort of putting them in some of the specific kiln sites and mapping them to specific kiln sites in China, as well as a way of understanding the nature of trade within China itself and of course the rest of the world. These are some of the kilns. These are massive industrial complexes. For example, for this Chang era site, from here to here is nearly 200 meters. So they're really, really massive. That distance to 750 through 1300 AD. It's just a massive debris that one gets. A lot of this porcelain we also find in all East African sites, And I think one of the things that we are thinking about doing, and students to really get involved here, is essentially looking at the ongoing practices between traditional potters, for example, in Western Kenya, and in fact traditional potters in even towns like Fuzhou in China. And I think some of these traditional potters in China are now only actors. They are doing it for tourists. So this guy, for example, makes his pot, and then the tourists take their pictures and then collapses it, waits to make the bedroom. But it's really, really interesting to do that as we look at what is really changing. I've been extremely fortunate in securing a lot of funding for my own research. And I'm hoping that this is something that we can continue to do here in the coming years. Thank you very much.
So I think we need to transition technology so I plug in or chit-chat about this stuff.
Jeff, I've often marveled and wondered at how archaeologists choose to site their trenches. In other words, you have this enormous map of Manda and some very, very localized trenching. How do you know that you want to dig here and here and here and here?
In the past, our predecessors didn't have the advantage of technology. But presently what we do is we do geophysical mapping of the sites. And so we did magnetometer as well as we use a ground penetrating radar, run it over, map the entire site, so that we exactly know places with high magnetic content that we then go and try to excavate. It's more like, today archaeology has become more like fishing. So you see a school of fish and then you drop your line. It's become more like that. And so the early stages of preparing the site are very labor intensive because you still have to map the whole site. And so that when you now excavate it, because excavation becomes a very expensive undertaking. You just don't want to shoot and miss. You want to go exactly where you're going. So technology has really advances in technology have been extremely useful for us. There is some luck too.
All right, so I'm going to switch environments altogether. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing underwater. I'm a marine ecologist by training, and a lot of what my interests I focus on is how coral reefs are constructed. That is from an ecological perspective. How do coral reefs assemble themselves, and what are some of the forces that result in their destruction? And the premise is that if you can understand what's causing their decline, you can then address the issues that could slow the process down and perhaps even mitigate the decline of the reefs altogether. When I finished up my PhD, where I did a lot of my work in the Florida Keys and also Panama, one of the emerging issues for marine ecologists was the role of diseases. This is a picture from the Florida Keys, and this is a NOAA boat that we did a lot of research off of. It wasn't always this calm. It was almost like a lake. Most of the time you were in 3-4 foot swells and you were being tossed around. You had tanks strapped to your back and stuff like that. I literally got sick underwater. I've actually thrown up underwater. I was being swished back and forth so often. But the work is, when I was finishing up my dissertation work, there was an emerging question that was based on the idea of diseases and whether or not there were important ecological forces underwater. For a very long time, people thought that the marine environment was really protected and isolated from diseases that affect terrestrial organisms. And that was probably mostly out of ignorance more than anything else. And also because if you think about it, scuba diving was only about 30, 40 years old. And so people hadn't been looking extensively underwater until fairly recently versus what terrestrial ecologists have been doing for millennia. There were a couple of things that were happening beginning in the late 80s that started to ring the bells for marine ecologists. One was the die-off of this very dominant coral in the Caribbean. These corals were everywhere in very shallow water, and within a span of a couple of years, they simply died out from the Caribbean altogether. And it was sort of like the Dutch elm disease in the marine environment. You had all these millions of Dutch elm trees. In a span of 4 or 5 years, they were completely gone, billions of them. So that happened. Not too long after that, another disease broke out, and it began at the Caribbean terminus of the Panama Canal. One of the scientists noticed the die-out of a sea urchin. These are very important. You probably had some if you have ever had sushi. The sea urchin roes are a very important source of food, and when you make sushi and things like that. But they're also important ecologically because they're like the gazelles of the ocean environment. They go around grazing grasses and algae, and in essence keeping the marine environment relatively clean and devoid of these algae that can run amok if you let them. And so starting around 1980, scientists at the Smithsonian noticed that these things were dying out, and within a single year the disease sort of spanned the entire Caribbean basin. And by the end of it, it only took a year, more than 95% of these sea urchins disappeared. And again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of these organisms dying out in a single year. And so these large, very large disease outbreaks began to focus the attention of marine ecologists on the role of diseases. During that time, another disease outbreak was happening. It was an outbreak that was affecting sea fans. And these are the sea fans that are very common to the Caribbean. So they're about yay tall, and they're flat, and that's why they're called sea fans. And they're a very important part of the Caribbean reef now because many of the other corals have been dying out. When I was finishing up my dissertation, there was a disease that was affecting these corals, and they were causing these things to die within a single year. And it began in an island off the coast of South America. And again, it did this ring around the Caribbean, starting off in South America, off the coast of South America. And Florida Keys was the last place to be hit. And so you can just sort of track this going across the Caribbean basin along with the loop current that is a dominant current in the Caribbean basin. And so we spent a lot of time underwater trying to track the outbreak of this disease. Part of the work took us to the Bahamas, San Salvador in particular. This is the corals here. This is just the stingray. Might give you something else to focus on. San Salvador was very interesting because San Salvador is in essence a vestige of these organisms that secreted the calcium carbonate out of the bottoms of the ocean. And this is a column of biogenic calcium carbonate that breaks to the surface. And the island of San Salvador, which is part of the Bahamian Islands, sort of sticks on top of that. And so if you swim maybe 40, 50 yards from the shore to the edge of this thing, you're looking down at maybe 3,000 meters of water. Right? So you could be in 15 feet of water, and all of a sudden you look over, there's about 2 kilometers of water. It's a very spectacular place. You can dive on the edge of the wall, and sometimes you get disoriented, and a lot of people don't come back because they get sort of narked and they keep swimming down when they should be coming up. The Bahamas is sort of interesting because it was isolated. We thought that these diseases were happening in places where there's lots of tourism and people, and all the other things that were happening to the coastal environment was acting synergistically with these diseases. And so the fact that the island of San Salvador, which is the most isolated of the Bahamian Islands, was being affected by this spectacularly. In fact, one group of these sea fans were completely decimated by the end of this process. It was sort of interesting news. A lot of people had different ideas about why this was happening. Climate change is obviously one of the biggest drivers, and temperature change in particular. And so people looked at temperature data to figure out whether or not it was temperature driving this disease outbreak, maybe more so than, say, pollution coming from development. And none of the data show that to be the case. The data that we have from the Florida Keys, we monitored these sea fans for 10 years, and there's no sort of temperature signal in why these diseases are affecting the corals as they are. And we also know, for example, there are places way in the middle of the Pacific that get really warm, but they don't die out from diseases. And so it wasn't temperature per se. And so one of the hypotheses that our group is positing was the role of nitrogen pollution. Now, you're saying, well, how about the Bahamas? Bahamas is sort of anomalous in that regard because it's in the middle of nowhere. But if you think about the Caribbean basin and the atmosphere on top of the Caribbean basin, it's ringed by lots and lots of people. And nitrogen pollution enters the ocean primarily through rivers, but also through atmospheric deposition. So if you burn a lot of fossil fuel to make electricity, which is what we do, most of our electricity comes from the burning of coal, or running cars or any other industries that burn fossil fuels, all of that nitrogen gets volatilized, goes into the atmosphere, and then deposits back into the ocean. Not only that, there's another interesting thing about the Bahamas. connecting with Africa, there are constant windstorms that bring nutrients and other particles from the Saharan desert across the Atlantic Ocean and deposits them onto the Caribbean. Many parts of the Bahamian Islands are covered with fine clay sands that originated from West Africa, not from the local area. And so we know that there were lots of other things that were happening to make the story of Bahamas very, very complicated. And so recently, about 6 years ago, I reached out to a colleague of mine who I overlapped with when I was at Cornell as a postdoc, who is now a faculty at the University of Guam. And Guam is sort of interesting because it's in the middle of nowhere. Literally, it's in the middle of nowhere. It takes about 22 hours of travel to get there. And the population size isn't all that big. There's about 170,000 people. And so we've gotten away from sort of very, very expansive development. We've gotten away from these atmospheric deposition of nitrogen. And so we can isolate the role of people on a very small scale. And so that's where we began. I began a series of work with my colleague at Guam and also an old graduate student from me who's now a faculty at Hong Kong University, who is collaborating on this work. And so this is Guam. And if you've been to Florida Keys and other parts of the Caribbean, if you look down on a coral reef, on a nice coral reef, you would expect to find maybe a quarter or maybe 1/10 of that bottom covered by coral. And that's sort of the average coral cover on a coral reef in the Caribbean. It's declined. So maybe 30, 40 years ago, it would have been about 25%. On average, it's about 5% now. So, and if you go to the Florida Keys, we're talking about 1 or 2% coral cover, which is kind of tragic. This is a coral reef, maybe about 50 yards offshore from the Marine Lab at Guam. And you can see almost all of the bottom is covered with coral. So they have relatively intact and relatively vibrant coral. They do have problems. Their sewage is not treated, and so when you flush a toilet, it just goes right out to shore. There is some treatment, but not particularly advanced. And so the dominant source of nitrogen on Guam is sewage, not deposition, but sewage. People simply flushing their stuff into the ocean, and they simply flush the stuff out maybe half a kilometer offshore. And then the waves bring it back, of course. And so the nitrogen level on this island is very, very, very high. And so what we've recently published shows that the impact of disease, that is how bad diseases are, and there are diseases on this island of Guam, is related to how close they are to sources of nitrogen, sources of sewage inputs. And you know where they are. There are pipes that are out there, and so coral reefs that are close to high sources of nitrogen get hit harder than coral reefs that are farther away. And so this is about as natural an experiment can be. And I was just about 2 months after we published our study, there was another study who showed the same thing. So I was really glad that we beat them to the punch. But this study and the one followed ours was probably the first two to show on a large scale the impact of nitrogen pollution as a driver of coral diseases. And so I think we got into this question relatively in a timely way. The other thing I want to talk about is the role of students in this work. And so for all the times that I've been to Guam, I've always had students join me and doing their thesis work. This is Jamie, who's now working at NOAA, doing some surveys of the coral reefs. And one of the great things about Guam is that the reefs are really, really benign. So Florida Keys, you have to take a boat out. And I've taken students out on the Florida Keys as well, but when it gets really choppy, you're on the boat, the tanks are clanking around, people are falling over. So, and the reefs are about 10 kilometers offshore, so you always have to take a boat, and you have to be at the mercy of the weather, whether or not. And I've been in some really harrowing situations where we've lost our sonar and our radar. There are 6 foot, 7 foot seas, and it's not as bad as some of the New England work that my colleagues have done, but it's really benign. This is 7 or 8 feet of water, so you can do most of your work on snorkel. You can see the surface of the ocean is pretty glassy clean, and so it's really, really easy, and I feel pretty good about throwing students out there and working with me on some of these projects. You don't have to scuba dive, which is a liability issue, and so studying corals, this is Kate Pinkerton, whom I think Peter knows. She was also another graduate student. She came through my lab as an undergrad and then continued on to do graduate work on seagrasses. And so there she is studying seagrasses. It doesn't get any easier than that. Right? So what you're seeing here is a quadrat, and so what she's measuring is estimating the cover of the bottom that is comprised of seagrasses, and that is a measure of the health of the seagrass beds, and she uses that to assess the impact of nitrogen pollution again on these ecosystems. This is a shot of Megan Cuddy, who most recently joined me this past summer. Megan, she's an undergraduate. She was a sophomore when this happened. She was continuing on with the seagrass work, but again, we're right, here's land. And so if things get rough, you just walk off and you wait. Now, Megan was really lucky because this particular summer trip also took us to Chuuk. Now, Chuuk is an even tinier island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You go to Guam, which is about, I think, 12 degrees north of the equator. Chuuk is about 8 degrees north of the equator. And it's a tiny, tiny island in amongst a number of different islands that make up this atoll. Now, atolls are prehistoric or sunken volcanoes with peaks that are that break above the surface of the water, and corals ring each of these little peaks around them. As you can imagine, the water is spectacularly clean, and we're probably in about 60, 70 feet of water, and you can see the surface from it. The corals are incredibly luxurious. So this is about 2.5 feet of water, and you can see where the land is. And if I wanted to get to shore, I'd have to walk over all of these living corals. And again, you can see how calm the water is, how clear the water is. And so it's spectacularly beautiful as well as easy place to work. I was able to get out to Chuuk was because a colleague of mine had this connection, and apparently, I didn't know this, there's a marine lab there, which is run by the Koreans. And so we were invited out to take a look at the coral reefs and sort of infuse ideas, doing research and kinds of things that the staff scientists could be thinking about in terms of nitrogen pollution and some of the other techniques that my group uses. And finally, you should always include pictures of sharks if you're doing biology. And so this is probably about 70 feet of water. I was on snorkel. This was after a dive. And so you can dive just right amongst those things. They're about 5 or 6 feet. And they will swim around you, and then they sort of hang around in groups, so it's pretty cool.
What kind of sharks?
So these are black-tip reef sharks. Yeah. So these are some of the exotic places that I get to do my research. So I want to stop there and open this up to questions and comments. And so the two other things I wanted to do with this session is to see if there's any opportunities for collaboration. Can I wheeze myself out to Kenya with you at some point? Or would anybody like to come to Guam and study sort of the impacts of the realignment of the Pacific Ocean? Because right now Guam is in the midst of a move. The Marines from Okinawa are being restationed in Guam, and the population on Guam is to change by 20% in a span of about 4 years. And that's important to me because that impacts their infrastructure and the ability to treat wastewater, which they really don't, as well as the social implications of this relatively massive move.
Has there been engineering testing as to what a 20% increase in population is going to do to this?
There's a huge environmental impact assessment, as you could expect. So the Department of Defense carried out a huge EIS. Most of the environmental impacts they don't really worry so much about. They raise national security issues as a trump card.
So they outweigh.
Yeah. So there's a huge port there. They've isolated a lot of the activities to different parts, but we're not just talking about the Marines. We're talking about families and the contractors and all of the other services that will be required to support those individuals.
I know that in the Middle East they've been moving, in Iraq and Afghanistan they've been moving towards solar, a lot of mobile solar power and a lot of LEDs and various energy efficiencies, so they don't have to convoy all that fuel around. Is that, I mean, the sustainability of the military seems to be a big deal in terms of, for national defense reasons, not having to resupply with fuel. Is that impacting on, like their lead when they build a new barracks or something? Is it lead sort of by solar power, like the building across the street here, or across the way.
See, that's something I wouldn't know, and this would be a great opportunity for somebody who's interested in those sorts of issues to sort of piggyback research opportunities. In terms of their, they have their own power plants. They don't use the ones that everybody else uses for lots of different reasons. But the biggest impact from my perspective is literally the amount of poop that they will put into the coastal waters.
Yeah.
And that's the big concern. And as far as I know, there is no plan to upgrade the wastewater treatment plants. So about half the people on the island reside on sewer lines. And again, they go through wastewater plants that are either not working or simply filter out the big stuff and pump it offshore. The remaining 50% live on cesspits or injection wells. And because the island is partially carbonate, it's like injecting sewage into a sponge. It simply gets washed out to shore. And so we can measure fairly easily the impact of sewage entering coastal ecosystems. And now that the economy is rebounding, tourism is also rebounding as well. Guam relies on tourism as the second most important economic driver. So the military is the most important, and all of the other federal monies that they get. And also the second is tourism. And so as Japan rebounds back, more and more Japanese are coming. And interestingly, the Russians are coming. As a number of Russians are getting very, very wealthy, they're moving to different parts of the world, and Guam apparently is now a destination for Russian tourists. So some very interesting things.
Is anybody taking advantage of experimentation with human composting, human waste composting?
They're not really. Again, a lot of it has to do with who's going to pay for it.
When the military isn't?
They will think about what happens on their bases, but they are not thinking too much about sort of the impacts around the island. I mean, they recognize they will have an impact, but
they're not required. I know they are required. Like if they have an impact, there's an impact fee for military families attending schools in D.C. There's a certain amount of money that goes to D.C. schools and Arlington schools to deal with the impact of their kids. So there must be some.
I'm sure there is, but I'm sure the money, whatever money gets put into the local coffers, the priorities, the wastewater treatment plant is probably not very high. It's a huge infrastructure investment. If you think about D.C., and these are some of the local ties, some of the students that I work in D.C. with, the Potomac is, in many cases, the same as the situation in Guam. We have a combined sewer system where if it gets really rainy, all the sewage simply washes into the Potomac River, untreated, raw sewage. And because D.C. was sued by the EPA, we are now paying stormwater fees to create the Blue Plains wastewater treatment, which will take out a lot of the nutrients and also separate out the sewage water from stormwater. Tunnels, yeah, they're resizing the tunnels. And we're just doing that now. And we're doing it kicking and fighting. The same thing in the Florida Keys. Even some of the best hotels, if you flush the toilet, and people have done this, they put in viral particles as tracers, inert viral particles. It takes about a day for a toilet flushed in the Sheraton to end up on a reef 8 kilometers offshore. Yeah. And they fought kicking to put in a tertiary wastewater treatment plant in the Florida Keys, in spite of the fact that it generates like $1 billion a year for tourism.
With the government role changing as you've described, do you see your ability to conduct research there getting more challenging or easier, or no change?
Yeah, not really. I mean, they have been pretty cooperative. There are some sites that we need to access that go through military base. Other than the paperwork, they'll let you do that. The last time we tried, we're about to get on base, but they kicked us out because they were doing a strafing run, a bombing run, and so we have to worry about those sorts of things. But generally, they've been sort of cooperative, at least in that way, in terms of access. But they're not willing to sort of fund these sorts of research projects, and so the funding that I get has to come from, say, NOAA, and more recently from NSF. The DoD is not really interested in sort of basic research. And if they do want to do basic research, they fund internally. They get contractors and things like that, where they can control the information.
I was wondering if Guam is, I don't know what kind of agricultural land they have there, but I know the companies like Syngenta and Monsanto have been using Hawaii for a long time
Right.
to do experiments that they don't do on mainland in terms of isolating GMO crops. And there's been a revolt in Hawaii
Right.
on the Big Island, I think.
Yeah, papaya, for example, was one of the first. The other reason why we picked Guam is there's virtually no agriculture there, which could mess up pollution because fertilizer is different from sewage in terms of what they do in the environment. 1% of the island of Guam is dedicated to agriculture, so they get everything shipped in, which is bad, but it's good from our perspective. It just simplifies the ecosystem from our experimental perspective. And so finally, trying to get undergraduates involved in research. I'm glad Peter is here because the Dean's Office has been very generous in funding undergraduates in the College of Arts and Sciences and getting them out to some of these places. I think the last 3 or 4 undergraduates who have come through my lab anyway have had funding from the Dean's Office and from the Provost's Office. And so I think there's opportunities out there. I've also had grants to get students out there. But I think having students out there is also very fun for me and also instructive for them. The number of the students who have gone through my lab have done these sorts of experiences have also been very competitive for national awards and scholarships in graduate schools. And so I think there are lots of benefits of trying to pull students into your lab both at the graduate and the undergraduate level. One student who graduated just maybe a year and a half ago, she was a Fulbright scholar and now she's just coming back from Australia. I have another student who is applying for another Fulbright. And so I think there are good things that can come from getting these students out.
What sort of liability protection do you offer?
Again, Guam is great in that respect. I worry less about students, some scraping things and stuff like that, but most things I can bring them back. They have your typical risk management, knows that they're going, so they have insurance that way. So they have to sign waivers and things like that. But the places that I go to, I try to minimize exposure to some of the other dangers that I would expose myself to, but not them. And I don't know how it is where you travel. I mean, you probably have to worry about things like malaria and internal parasites. Not so much the places I've been so far.
Yeah, we do worry about that. But I think in East Africa, the main concern, I think, is proximity to the Middle East. I think Al-Qaeda is a security risk today. But I've taken nearly 180 students to Kenya in the last 20 years. And this was usually through my NSF grants, but also I was able to get 2 research experience for the graduate grants. And I was able to get students there. In talking to Sarah Dumont, I think she's been a major supporter of taking students to Africa, because her argument is that I think most students who go abroad, especially students who go to Europe, essentially get harmed or die than have been to other places. And I think it has to do with the risk factor, because the risks are presumably higher in Africa. I think that we take more precaution, whereas when students are going to Italy or France, we think it's more like here. So in fact, we don't really prepare the students well, and therefore they end up, in fact, are getting murdered or killed. It's been very good, but I think that one has to be always careful, particularly with wherever you take students, whether it's in DC or Chicago. The risks are often there. But certainly I think the outcome, a lot of the students that often have this experiential knowledge often go on to do great things in life. And many of them have their lives changed forever in a lot of ways. Many of us, in fact, got attracted into what we do precisely because of those early childhood experiential knowledge that we get through fieldwork. So I think it's pretty good. I envy you.
No, I envy you.
One of the things that one of the programs that we are trying to develop is the collaboration with colleagues at University of Pune and Deccan in India, where we'll be taking students there for 6 weeks. India is very stable, but it's also a nation that is on the rise, and a nation that I think we need to engage in a lot of ways. I've been to China and India to find that despite the fact that we are all focused on China, I think that we make an error by sort of leaving out South Asia, because South Asia, especially India, is really on the rise, and it's a world that we especially need to engage, both for our own competitive edge, but also because there's so much shared history there. Language, for example, is not really a problem, so students are able to move back and forth. But just the richness of India's culture, from the arts to the sciences, is just incredible. And so that's one area that I really want to pay a lot of attention to as we move forward.
Any other questions? Thoughts, suggestions? Any exotic places you've been to? None?
I've been to Calcutta, Jaipur, and I lived in Zimbabwe for 2 years.
Yeah.
In South Africa, Malawi, Angola, Gabon.
Wow.
You should have been up here. How about you, Peter? What are some of the exotic places that you've been?
Oh, I've just been a tourist. I'm a French professor. You know, I chose my, as I was saying to you earlier, I chose my nice places to do research thing for a different reason, right? But
So one of the great things about Africa is just how unpredictable it is, because no day is ever the same. And I think that it's very taxing for the director, because you're always working on the edge, because you just don't know what will happen, when the car will break down, or a promised lecturer will not show up, or show up 3 hours later. But it's just this sense of preparedness and the creativity of the people, how people are able to eke a living on so little, but they still have so much hope in what would otherwise be a sea of hopelessness. Is really very intriguing. I found that when I take students there, they just marvel at just how privileged they actually are. And I've taken a whole range of students from, very poor backgrounds, inner city kids, to extremely wealthy. But all of them come back extremely changed. And one of the things I've always done is take, at the end of the field school, take these students to visit my mother. My mother doesn't speak English, but my mother raised all these kids who are extremely brilliant and successful. And when she never had to read to us. And so I think that one of the things that students learn when they see these contrasts in terms of just family life and this within rural Africa, and they compare to their own, something changes in their lives. And you can always see this, I think, when the students go to Guam, and they sort of learn about how you have 170,000 people existing almost exclusively on imported food, because nothing grows there. That this is an economy that is sustained not but by trade and by government. It really, really changes the way in which they essentially look at the whole very idea of globalization, international trade and governance of this militarization of the world. David Vine will be very good,
Yeah.
I think, in collaborating with.
Yeah. You've been emailing back and forth.
Yeah, I think it'll be his research. I wonder, because I think it's becoming very well known. So the military might sort of refuse you access, but I think as I was thinking about what you are talking about, realize that this is a great place, particularly with increased militarization in the region, that what his research will benefit much from what you're doing.
Yeah, and one of those things, I do think about it, but I also want to make sure that I'm isolated enough where I'm identified as a sort of marine scientist, not involved in policy per se, unless I jeopardize my perceived objectivity and possibility of working with some of these agencies.
Exactly, yeah.
Shadow collaboration.
Shadow collaboration. They're probably listening already, Amy. So.
Giving data to him without him being involved.
Secret drop-offs and Mary
Google.
Yeah.
Until it gets published, of course,
Yeah.
and then
Then we're in trouble.
Professor, I've been undergraduate student in the Answer department, and I do my research in Ghana in West Africa. And I've been thinking a lot more. I'm in the middle of my foundational, comprehensive examinations dealing with why it's this big theory, and thinking more about not only the ways that China and India's increased presence in Africa, has very practical implications, but also the way it has more theoretical implications in the way that we think about post-colonialism or globalization, and these ideas of maybe South-South solidarity, but what is solidarity necessarily, and is it? What does it look like when it takes on a more predatory tone, as some policies oftentimes do? So I personally am also really interested in looking more at the ways that India not only is rising very quickly in its own right, but also the ways that it's increasingly becoming more present on the continent.
Yeah, that's also good. Well, India's relationship with Africa is more than 3,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's been continuous, particularly in Eastern Africa. And I think the new South-South relationship, I think, in most cases, is a response to nearly 500 years of, in fact, the West exploiting the North, essentially exploiting the South. Mm-hmm. And I think that because of that, many African nations are entering into these relationships, often blindly. China has obviously won the public relations war because China's argument is the policy is lack of interference. So they look the other way. But they have found a way of, in fact, working with the African elite in ways that I think the West was never able to do that. What they do is they come to a city like Nairobi or Accra, and they say, we are going to build roads for you, modernize your cities. Right? So they're able to, in a city like Nairobi, change the time it takes a policymaker to drive from his house to the office and back home from 2 hours to 30 minutes. And they've been able to do that. And so while they are making the cities, beautifying the city and improving the infrastructure, they're also building roads to the resource-rich areas. And so these roads are essentially now funneling a lot of the resources, whether it's biofuel or minerals out to the coast and then back to China. In fact, in many ways, I think whenever you raise this critique, some of my friends and relatives who are now top government officials just won't listen. So in a lot of ways, I think we have lost because they're sort of looking at history. And I think the other thing is what happened in 1989 when the Cold War ended. Europe, Western Europe, and the U.S. left Africa and they ran off to Eastern Europe. And that void has now been filled, and now as we try to come back, we are essentially fair weather friends. So no one is really paying attention. It's very, very tragic. Because in Ghana, where the structural adjustment programs actually worked, Ghana was on a trajectory towards, in fact, development. And I think that's sort of Liberia, nearby Liberia is in shambles. In Zimbabwe, for example, the Chinese are all over the place. But Angola is the same thing. So it's really, really sad, and but I think it is what it is. And I don't really know the way out of that. I guess Africa will just have to learn that and make the right decisions. But the way it is now, I think China and India are winning the peer battle in Africa. They are siphoning the resources in ways that I think Europeans and Americans were not able to do in the last 400 years.
Why do you think that is?
Part of it, I think, has to do with poor governance within Africa itself. And I think the very underdeveloped system of governance in a lot of ways, an almost absence of accountability in a lot of ways, that is often driven by I don't want to say ethnicity and all of that, but ethnicity is very much a part of it. If you look at the conflict in South Sudan, it is not ethnic as it is, but it always somehow turns out to be driven by that. And I think it has to do mostly with when leaders sense that they are losing, they play the ethnic card. And I think that they've been able to masterfully manipulate ethnic loyalty and pride, I think, to the disadvantage of the development of the nation. But you also have very structured, class, very elitist system, but very much like the European model, where, in this case, in East Africa, in Kenya, for example, if you want to look at who is who, there are various high schools that people went to. And that's what runs the country. So that there's this kind of socio-economic ties that have been built over the last 50 years. Mostly due to the system that the Europeans left in place, have remained intact, have not yet been dismantled. So because of that, wealth is concentrated into the hands of very, very few people who are not willing to let power go.
Okay, so it's 3:15. Let me thank Chap for braving the flight back and also spending the time to put the slides together and forego sleeping for the next few days as you finish up some grant proposal reviews. So thank you for that, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. So with that.
Thank you.